the state of Mississippi. We're supported by our mother organization, My Brother's Keeper. Mississippi Positive Network is now 200 strong, always looking to reach even more of our sisters and brothers. I am also a board member of Southern AIDS Coalition. I've seen SAC grow over the last 20 years from a grassroots, hand-on working board with no real office or staff to what it is today, a dedicated, dynamic team of full-time professionals who reach across the South to other organizations and independent advocates, all of us wanting the same thing, to end the HIV epidemic. What exactly is our epidemic? Our particular work is centered on HIV, but it is impossible to separate HIV from the social and economic intersections which help to actually mount this epidemic in the first place. And how do we end the epidemic? We do so by dismantling old paradigms, reaching deep into our hearts, and discovering a new vision for the South, a vision for our future, albeit born from our painful history. This new vision for the South fortifies equity and justice. It demands meaningful engagement of Southerners who are living with HIV. It calls us to look through a more surgical lens of intersectionality and trauma-informed care, the power of empowerment and the abolishment of stigma. We end the epidemic by ensuring all persons living with HIV are receiving optimum care and thriving. We end the epidemic by setting our goal of zero, and I mean zero, new HIV diagnoses in the South. We do it through awareness, testing, and policy aimed at constructing cutting-edge strategies and systems and structures which manifest the best we can be, especially when it comes to public health. I want to be the best I can be. I've always wanted to be the best I can be since growing up in the Mississippi Delta. My hometown was Ruleville, Mississippi, which was also the home of Fannie Lou Hamer. Recently, I've been obsessing on Fannie Lou Hamer. Sometimes I pinch myself, knowing that I live just blocks away from one of the greatest icons of the civil rights movement. Just think, as a little boy, I breathed the air that Fannie breathed. We looked up into the sky and dreamt under the same sun, slept under the same Mississippi moon. We felt the same breeze on a sweltering Delta day. We walked through the same downtown. And surely we spotted each other around Ruleville. It would have been possible for any two people not to have crossed paths in a tiny little cotton town back in the 1960s. But we would not have made eye contact or spoken to each other. I was a little white boy. If a gang of us little white boyhood friends were cycling down the sidewalk, Mrs. Hamer would likely have lowered her head and ducked across the street, as was required of all Black people in the Deep South. Imagine, it's 1963. I'm entering first grade. One day, Fannie Lou Hamer is testifying before the Democratic National Convention on national television, while President Lyndon Johnson is overheard saying, "We've got to do something about that Negro woman from Mississippi." And the next day, she knows better. She's walking down the street with us 6-year-old boys, and she knows better than to be caught looking us in the eye or expecting us to respect her. We had the right of way. Fast forward to the 1980s. My future could have not been more promising. Just out of Rice University and the University of Arizona, armed with a PhD and performing piano around the world. Then I settled in a railroad apartment in the East Village of Manhattan, living in some ways the bohemian life of rent, and bursting onto the music and theater scene in New York City. My office job took me across the pond as well. I worked with a theatrical agency. I scouted musicals and plays on the West End of London, wrote my reports, and then flew back home to Broadway. I loved my life. Every single day, every single night, I lived and breathed my creativity, my art. And then I didn't. I didn't love my life. An HIV diagnosis in 1986 and an AIDS diagnosis just a year later, it took it all away. Now let's fast forward again to 2004. I've lost my so-called life partner. He's dead, way, way too young. My job and finances and soul is dead. I've made the decision to come home to Mississippi and live on the farm with my parents until I too could just disappear into oblivion. After all, it wouldn't be long. At one moment in time, I'd lost over 60% of my body weight, wasting syndrome. I'd sunk into a profound depression. My cheeks had sunken too. In my mind, I was a leper, an Auschwitz prisoner, a starving, shivering, pitiful dog like on one of those ASPCA commercials. Even worse, I was queer. I was an outcast with AIDS in Mississippi. Even gay men in Mississippi would be horrified to look at me. None would befriend me or be in my company. My internal stigma and shame and embarrassment nearly led literally to my suicide. But enough of that. I turned it all around. Thanks mostly to a loving mama and daddy. On today, on Southern HIV/AIDS Awareness Day, it's nearly 2 decades later. The depression is gone. My cheeks have been injected with a permanent filler, nearly 200 needle sticks into either side of my face over the course of a half a dozen trips to Tijuana, Mexico. Not a big deal. Today, I'm overweight. And today I have my piano and 2 dogs and a home of my own and a yard and a beautiful life partner and a small but loving church family here in the Mississippi Delta. I'm happier than I ever thought possible. Why is it so deeply ingrained in us that being happier than I ever thought possible is reserved for only the privileged few like myself? Today, on Southern HIV/AIDS Awareness Day, I compel us to think big and broad and bravely as we commit to action. Every soul that walks on Southern soil not only deserves to be happier than ever thought possible, it's not negotiable. There are no exceptions. Every soul deserves that. I'm asking you, me, all of us, to dig deeper into the lives of our civil and human rights heroes and sheroes that shine not only from our past, but our present. Let's march with the powerful women and men of the South who need us to knock on every door in the neighborhood, to promote voter registration and outrageous activism at the polls. Let's make some trouble. Let's call out racism and homophobia and xenophobia, even among friends and family. Let's communicate with legislators. Let's denounce anti-science and lies on social media. Let's engage those teachable moments with our children when it comes to sex education. Let's honor and protect our young by talking truth when it comes to sexually transmitted diseases. Let's reclaim our religions, which teach us unconditional acceptance and inclusion and bold anger when the temple has fallen to money-making, dominant culture, greed, and corruption. Here's our to-do list. Here's our to-do today list. We must tackle COVID. That's number one. It's time to talk about all people living with HIV to be not only vaccinated, but to be given the subsequent booster. CDC has now green-lighted these boosters. Number two, we must stop laying urban health applications onto rural life in the South. People living with HIV in the rural South must often endure isolation and separation, more intense religious and cultural stigma, and the utter absence of any opportunity to physically connect with other people living with HIV. In a great part of the rural South, access to mental health providers is non-existent. Telehealth is promising. It's the way of the future, but it requires access to device, access to internet, access to skills training. Thirdly, we must now address HIV and aging. Persons who have lived a long time with HIV and or AIDS also face loneliness and isolation, depression, and grief. Comorbidities are more likely to happen with older people living with HIV, such as early onset diabetes, heart disease, and other complications. Many aging people, like myself, cannot take modern pill-a-day therapies. Our bodies must stick to what's called salvage medications therapies, a regimen of 16 pills or more. You should see my medicine cabinet. All of this in the face of not having had the opportunity to build up retirement finances and facing cognitive and physical decline. We must ramp up community education to end the HIV epidemic. The COVID pandemic has required us to connect online tenfold, so let's run with that. We will soon find ways to reunite physically, but in addition, let's populate our HIV advocacy trainings, programs, webinars, conversations, and campaigns 100-fold. There's really some great stuff out there in the HIV world. Let's get people on those trainings and programs. And number 5, we must stop listening to the old Southern adage, never discuss religion and politics in public. Let's be bold. Let's converse lovingly about theology and political solutions, Southern solutions. Let's practice compassionate confrontation with the old South, but discompassionate realness when it comes to some of the most greatest gifts from our Creator: science, medicine, epidemiology, masks, soap, and the power of community. All of us pulling together to fight for humanity. By no means must we stay silent or comfortable. Fannie Lou Hamer was never silent. She still is never silent. I can hear her say still, nobody's free until everybody's free. And I can still hear her sing, this little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. So happy Southern HIV/AIDS Awareness Day, and let us now lift every voice and sing with me. This little light of ours, we're gonna let it shine. This little light of ours, we're gonna let it shine. This little light of ours, we're gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Thank you.